G'day everyone, my name's Peter. I serve at Night Church, if you don't know me. I'll just get myself set. Do you like working out riddles or mysteries? Adam picked all the easy ones on my list. Didn't think you were going to get the hard ones. Anyway. There's a relatively new murder mysteries show that's streaming at the moment. It's based on the idea of true crime podcasts. True crime shows and podcasts have continued to rise in prominence over the last decade. Maybe you can remember back to shows like Murder, She Wrote or Perry Mason. Some people love a good mystery. They try to work it out while they're watching or while they're listening. Other people are content to wait and see what happens in the end. And still others, no interest whatsoever. A couple of weeks ago, we were gripped by the disappearance and recovery of Cleo Smith. That was significant. But mysteries can have different levels of importance, can't they? Of far less importance are mysteries like why there's so much publicity for the Scottish Loch Ness Monster and so little publicity for the Australian version. Some parts of the Bible can seem like mysteries, and Jesus' parables, they seem like they're connected to mysteries too. And while that might be the case, the subject of today's passage is really clear. Let's look at the text, verse 24. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like. And verse 31. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like. And verse 33. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like. I'm going to give you one guess what the parables today are about. Say it with me. The kingdom of heaven. Matthew wants us to think about the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus says what he says because Jesus wants us to think about the kingdom of heaven. So he explains what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's like it's like weeds in the wheat field. It's like the mustard seed, and it's like the yeast. Let's go. Verse 24. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the weeds sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where did the weeds come from?" "An enemy has done this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I'll tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Last week in verse 11, we heard that the meaning of parables needs to be revealed, and oh yeah, our job just got a little bit easier because Jesus explains the characters and the place and the actions in verse 37, which Steph read for us. Here's the parable again in light of what Jesus explains. Jesus, the Son of Man, sows people of the kingdom in the world. Before they've grown, the devil sows his people among the people of the kingdom. Under Jesus' sovereignty and patience, they'll both grow alongside each other, but at the end time, Jesus will send angels to remove everything that causes sin and all who do evil. His angels will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be great sorrow and torment. then the righteous will shine brightly in the kingdom of their Father. So what's Jesus showing about the kingdom of heaven here? And not unlike recent verses in Matthew, we see the people of the world divided into two categories. The first group are people of the kingdom planted by Jesus. The other group are people of the evil one planted by Satan. There's a divide that's not insignificant, but it's extremely significant. Because the eternal outcome of these two groups are complete opposites. Shining with brilliance in the kingdom of heaven, sorrow and anguish. Jesus has spoken about judgment in Matthew already, but here is a real tangible explanation of the suffering and pain that will come to those who are not planted in Jesus. And this should cause us to ask a very important question. Then who am I planted by? Am I wheat planted by Jesus? Or am I a weed planted by Satan? Now, when we hear about weeds, it could trigger thoughts of all types of weeds we commonly see. However, it's probable that the weed referred to in this parable is bearded darnel. It often grows where wheat grows. It looks very similar to wheat. You can see them side by side there in the early stages of growth. It looks very similar. And it becomes more distinguishable from the wheat once the seed heads form. This might help us understand the servants' response as they eventually notice a difference between the wheat and the weeds. Jesus' direction to the servant shows that final judgment will not come immediately, not before the right time. This might have surprised the disciples, but in it we see Jesus' character of mercy and patience, and we see some insight into his plan. Now, these are characteristics that are reinforced in other parts of the New Testament, like 2 Peter chapter 3. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promises, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. Jesus' response and his character should in turn influence how we view other people. Chris took us last week through the parable of the sower, and in that the view of people's hearts was fairly absolute. The sower sowed on the path, rocky places, thorns, good soil. So we might be tempted to put people in certain boxes in our own minds. Oh, that person's, they're on the path. That person over there, well, they're always going to be stuck amongst the thorns. But today's parable, it broadens our perspective a little bit. Are they a weed, or are they wheat that hasn't formed yet? We should be persistently urgent in declaring the kingdom with everyone, both with those who might be wheat and those who might be weeds, because we don't always know people's hearts, and judgment is coming at its set time. There are other things that we learn about the kingdom of heaven from this parable. One of them comes in verse 41, where Jesus makes a completely astounding claim. He says, "The Son of Man will send harvesters to weed out of his kingdom." The kingdom of heaven is Jesus' kingdom. That's a mystery revealed. What was once only known as God's kingdom now is also revealed as Jesus' kingdom. Not because the kingdom's changed hands, but because the fullness of Jesus' identity is being revealed. And the king mentions a practical difference between the weeds, one which will set them apart at the end of time. According to verse 41 and 43, the weeds are those who do evil, and those who go on to shine with brilliance in the kingdom are the righteous. If you're concerned about whether you'll be judged righteous or evil, you probably should be concerned. If you're complacent about how you'll be judged, you should be worried. But if you're resting in the imputed righteousness of God, you can have no fear. Someone might say, aren't we all evil, planted by Satan? But if we remember the context of Matthew, we can say from chapter 5, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And Romans 1-3 explains clearly that in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, and that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. So those who believe are given God's righteousness. It's put into them. And so we receive it and we live in it. Although the final divide isn't coming immediately, this man, Jesus, claims to be the Lord of heaven, who makes a distinction between the children of righteousness and the children of Satan. What this parable implies is a massive warning for all people. Jesus will not tolerate sin forever. The harvest will come, and he'll bring judgment, and that judgment is very real. Do you have ears to hear this message of the kingdom? Come, be planted by Jesus. Jesus plants people from all walks of life, people in all places, people of all ages, even people who watched Murder, She Wrote. Don't think you can hear this mystery and just safely watch along, waiting to see what happens in the end. Don't think that you can safely go along ignoring the kingdom of heaven with no interest whatsoever. Now, this is a riddle that you can't safely ignore. Jesus' kingdom starts small, but will be large by the end when the righteous shine and are spared anguish. That's the point of this passage. I'll say it again. The Jesus' kingdom starts small, but will be large by the end when the righteous shine and are spared anguish. Jesus wants us to think more about the kingdom of heaven. So, verse 31, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it's the smallest of the seeds, yet when it grows, it's the largest of the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches. What does this next picture show us? Well, put simply, the kingdom starts small. My family likes avocados. More specifically, they like guacamole. And one of my daughters likes guacamole so much that she decided to try and germinate an avocado seed. I was sitting on the lounge one day and the girls, all three of them came in excitingly. They're growing, they're growing. And so we've had avocado seeds on our windowsill ever since. That is, up until today. Here's our avocado tree. Oh, look at that. Isn't she cute? And I'm watching this thing grow, and it got this high with only tiny little leaves on it, right? And I'm thinking, man, how big's this thing going to get? And so I do a bit of research, and it turns out that the Hass avocado tree, of which this tree, can you guys see that at the back? That's our avocado tree. You can come and have a look at it later if you want. So it turns out the Hass avocado tree, of which this probably descends, can grow to be about 12 to 14 metres high. And also, because of plant genetics, they reckon there's about 1 in 10,000 chance that the fruit of this tree would taste any good. Chances of it being planted in my backyard? 0. However, today, this tree, it's fulfilled its life's purpose, and that is to help show you that small things can grow big. But why did Jesus pick a mustard seed? He could have picked an avocado, but avocados weren't in Palestine until 1908, so that would have been a bit confusing. Could have picked a fig tree. They grow pretty big too, bigger than mustard trees. They were pretty common, and they've got small seeds too. Jesus was deliberate in picking a mustard seed for this parable because of its size. He makes a point, though it's the smallest of all seeds. And it is small. I've got one here. Can you see that? No, you can't see it. You wouldn't even know if I've got a mustard seed or not. Oh, look, I've got another one in my pocket. I'm like one of those mime dudes. I do have a mustard seed. But it's small. It's tiny. And not only that, but because of culturally, referencing something as the size of a mustard seed was used to indicate how tiny something was. That it was of the smallest amount. So while there's importance in the contrast between the beginning and the end, the main emphasis is on the tiny beginning, seemingly underwhelming, less than expected at the start. It's aptly called the parable of the mustard seed, not the parable of the mustard tree. A large tree, even enough for birds to perch in its branches, will come from something so small. That's the point of this parable. The kingdom of heaven has the smallest, most humble beginning. One person, an unimpressive family on earth. Not what was expected from the kingdom of the Messiah, miles short of the next golden era in Israel's history. And it would continue initially on that trajectory. Jesus despised and rejected, suffering the most humiliating and gruesome death alone. The beginning of the kingdom of heaven was small, but it would grow large, and it will grow even larger. It's easy to get discouraged with what we see in the world around us, isn't it? When we see where the world's headed. When we hear last week of the word falling on ground that's not compatible. Even more when we see that word hit the hearts of people we love and not find the right response. And we feel the pain of living as weed among weeds. And we can easily forget God's plan and how in control God is. And how much worse if you were one of Jesus' first followers. The whole nation had been anticipating one thing: the arrival of the Messiah and their vindication. Oh, that's two things. But they were both like sort of wound up together, right? But then the Messiah comes and, well, it doesn't quite look like what you were expecting. Even John the Baptist, who said at the start, I should be baptised by you, well, he comes to the point of asking, are you the one to come, or should we expect someone else? Jesus' kingdom starts small, but will be large by the end when the righteous shine and are spared anguish. Just skipped ahead. It's bad. Verse 33. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked through the whole dough. Similar to the last parable, this one explains that the kingdom of heaven starts small and has a big effect. In basic terms, yeast works because it feeds on the carbohydrates in flour and it permeates from one part of the dough to the other part of the dough. Jesus started his kingdom in Palestine 2,000 odd years ago, and as some people had ears to hear his message, it started to transform them. It spread from person to person, as it still does now, transforming people in the process, and it even reached to us here. Even though so small to begin with, the results are vastly disproportionate to its start. The kingdom of heaven starts small, but will be large by the end when the righteous shine and are spared anguish. And this brings us to, ding, 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 had a bit of a hint before, the bonus section of this passage, mysteries revealed. Now you might be thinking, oh man, I thought the sermon was going to finish soon. He had 3 points, he was already there. You might think I've added this new point in. But I'm not making a new point. I didn't just make up this slide for the screen and pick some random fonts and put them together. The fact is, with hindsight, you might be able to see it, that this point was always there. There were even some obvious hints as we went along. You didn't understand what the hints pointed to because you hadn't seen it arranged in this particular way before. So you didn't realise what was coming. I'm illustrating Matthew's next point. Verse 34 explains for us that a similar thing is going on in Jesus' teaching. Look along with me. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I'll open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. On top of last week's verses 9 to 17, Matthew shows us more about what Jesus' parables do. The word parables in chapter 13, it's broader than just like a narrative story. It includes proverbs and stories and riddles, puzzling sayings, figures of speech, all of which Jesus used, and quite regularly, it seems, according to verse 34. And whenever he spoke to them, he used different literary devices. But why? Verse 35 says that by his parables, Jesus fulfilled the prophecy of Psalm 78. Specifically, that Jesus would utter things hidden since the creation of the world. Psalm 78 is a history lesson. It's an overview of Israel's past. It includes things that they've heard and known, things that their ancestors told them, things that have been passed down to children and descendants in Israel. But the psalmist, he arranges these bits of their history in such a way, and he emphasises certain things so as to disclose and reveal something about these historical truths that were hidden in the past. In the case of Psalm 78, Asaph shows us that their nature was one of stubborn rebellion despite God's repeated mercy. He says of God and Israel, in spite of all he did, they still sinned, and despite of his wonders, they did not believe. And he showed them mercy, but they continued to turn away from him. And he put them to everlasting shame, and instead chose a remnant who would be shepherded by his servant David. So Asaph utters and reveals hidden things, mysteries of God's plan that mostly went unnoticed. The Jewish people in Jesus' time needed hidden things shown to them as well. They thought that they knew what the Messiah would look like. They thought that the kingdom coming would be as obvious as a meteor hitting Rome, that the Davidic Messiah would come in a flash and bring Israel back to its glory days. They thought that the start would be massive and that their pagan enemies would be swept up the moment the Messiah came. Living after Jesus' ministry and after his sacrifice and his resurrection from the dead, we have a complete picture of God's plan. We can see that Jesus is the suffering servant of Isaiah. We can see that he's our Passover lamb. And even what the crushing of the serpent's head and the striking of Jesus' own heel would mean. The people Jesus was speaking to then didn't have that revealed to them yet. So in every part of his ministry, Jesus brings to light things that have been there from the start, things right in front of people's eyes, but that were obscured and darkened because of the lenses through which they looked upon them. But not everyone was ready to hear the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven that Jesus was revealing. Jesus continues to divide. Many people listened to Jesus and walked away, maybe indifferent or puzzled, mildly intrigued. Jesus' disciples, we're told in verse 36, would come to Jesus and seek to understand what he was uttering. They would come and in him seek the way to the kingdom. Some would have ears to hear. Still today, even now, in this room, there are different responses to Jesus. Even with the absolute revelation of God in Jesus, even with God's mercy for sinners fully revealed, some will continue in the same pattern of rebellion that the old people of Israel chose. Which group will you be in? Wheat or weeds? These parables of Jesus, they're not something you can safely ignore. You can't safely wait it out and see what happens at the end of the age. The teachings of Jesus are far too important, and the stakes are far, far too high. So this message is over to you. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear.